In the remote Ozark Mountains of Arkansas, 1898 was a winter that changed everything. Deep in Blackwater Hollow, where ancient trees blocked sunlight and civilization felt like a distant memory, lived a dying patriarch whose final wish would horrify even the most hardened investigators. Ezekiel Thornfield, revered Confederate captain turned lay preacher, commanded absolute respect from scattered mountain families who trusted his word as gospel. But as consumption consumed his aging body, this pillar of the community made a decision that would leave both his daughters carrying the burden of his twisted legacy. The story I'm about to tell reveals how a man's obsession with preserving his bloodline transformed a remote homestead into a chamber of unspeakable horrors. What drove this respected leader to such unthinkable acts? How did he justify the unjustifiable to his own daughters? And what evidence did Sheriff Tobias Milliken uncover that made seasoned lawmen refuse to speak of it for decades? Prepare yourself for what's coming next, because what you're about to discover will test your understanding of human nature itself. Subscribe to stand with us in bringing these buried truths to light. Comment your city and time. We love seeing where these stories reach. The winter of 1898 brought an unusual blessing ceremony to Blackwater Hollow, one that would later haunt every witness who attended. Ezekiel Thornfield, the 62-year-old patriarch whose word had been law in these remote Arkansas mountains for nearly 3 decades, stood before his scattered community with consumption ravaging his once powerful frame. His neighbors, hardy mountain folk who trusted few outsiders, had gathered at his 400-acre homestead to receive what many believed would be his final spiritual guidance. But as Dr. Samuel Whitmore later documented in his medical journal, something deeply unsettling marked this December gathering beyond the obvious specter of death. Both of Ezekiel's daughters, 19-year-old Mercy and 17-year-old Charity, displayed the unmistakable signs of pregnancy. Their father announced with characteristic authority that both girls had recently married distant Thornfield cousins who worked the timber camps deeper in the Ozark wilderness. Reverend Josiah Blackwood, who had conducted monthly services in these mountains since the war's end, accepted this explanation without question, as did most attendees. Yet Dr. Whitmore's private notes, discovered decades later in his estate papers, recorded his immediate suspicion that something fundamental didn't align with Ezekiel's confident proclamation. The physician observed that both young women wore identical silver wedding bands, simple pieces that bore no distinctive markings or family characteristics typically found in mountain wedding jewelry. More disturbing still, neither girl displayed the joy or maternal contentment he had witnessed in hundreds of expectant mothers throughout his traveling practice. Instead, court records would later preserve his clinical observations of their pronounced fearfulness and marked reluctance to discuss their supposed marriages. When Dr. Whitmore attempted to examine the girls privately, as was customary for pregnant women, Ezekiel insisted on remaining present throughout, claiming his daughters required his protection and guidance. Clara Honeysuckle, the experienced midwife, whose Cherokee grandmother had taught her to read people's hearts as well as their bodies, harbored even deeper concerns about the Thornfield household that winter. Her detailed birth ledger, maintained meticulously for over 30 years, contained increasingly troubling entries about both pregnancies. The girls exhibited physical symptoms consistent with prolonged stress and fear rather than the natural anxieties of first-time mothers. Most disturbing to Clara's experienced eye was their identical pattern of flinching whenever men approached, a behavior she had previously observed only in women who had suffered violence or abuse. Throughout the harsh winter months, neighbors occasionally inquired about the mysterious husbands who had supposedly claimed the Thornfield daughters. Ezekiel provided elaborate explanations about their work obligations at distant logging operations, their need to establish proper homes before returning, and their plans to reunite with their wives after the spring thaw. Martha Crane, whose farm sat closest to the Thornfield property, later testified in court that she had never seen any evidence of these men's existence despite living within 2 miles of the homestead. No horses had been stabled, no additional provisions purchased, no letters received or sent. The community's acceptance of Ezekiel's explanations stemmed largely from his unquestioned authority as both Confederate veteran and lay preacher. His neighbors had relied on his leadership, biblical knowledge, and fair judgment for nearly 3 decades. When Sheriff Tobias Milliken later examined the social dynamics that enabled the deception, his investigation notes revealed a pattern of absolute deference to Ezekiel's word that had never been challenged or questioned. The Mountain families trusted him implicitly, viewing his pronouncements about his daughter's marriages as naturally within his patriarchal rights and religious authority. As winter gave way to early spring, both pregnancies progressed visibly. Yet the absent husbands remained conspicuously missing from all community activities. Reverend Blackwood's circuit preaching schedule brought him to Blackwater Hollow monthly, and his sermon notes, preserved in Baptist Association archives, show his growing private discomfort with the situation. He had performed no marriage ceremonies for the Thornfield girls, nor had any other minister in the region, yet he hesitated to challenge Ezekiel's authority directly. The Reverend's later testimony revealed his assumption that the marriages had occurred during one of his absences from the circuit. Dr. Whitmore's monthly visits to check on the pregnancies yielded increasingly disturbing observations that he carefully documented in code within his medical records. Both young women showed signs of malnutrition despite living on a prosperous homestead with abundant food stores. Their father's control over every aspect of their medical care struck the physician as excessive, even by mountain standards where male authority typically dominated family decisions. Most significantly, neither girl ever spoke independently or expressed personal wishes about their pregnancies or impending motherhood. The truth began emerging in March 1899 when Ezekiel's consumption finally claimed his life. The mountain community gathered again, this time for his funeral, expecting the mysterious husbands to appear and claim their grieving wives. Instead, only Mercy and Charity stood beside their father's grave, heavily pregnant and completely alone. Their isolation struck even the most trusting neighbors as fundamentally wrong, creating the first cracks in the community's acceptance of Ezekiel's version of events. Sheriff Milliken arrived in Blackwater Hollow 3 days after the funeral, alerted by Dr. Whitmore's formal request for investigation into the circumstances surrounding the Thornfield daughters. The physician had broken his customary professional discretion after Ezekiel's death removed the immediate threat to his patient's safety. Milliken's preliminary interviews with community members revealed a troubling consensus that no one had ever actually met, seen, or heard from the supposed husbands despite months of claimed marriage. The sheriff's first crucial discovery came when he examined Newton County's official marriage records, maintained in the courthouse at Jasper. Despite Ezekiel's repeated claims of proper ceremonies and legal documentation, no marriage certificates existed for either daughter. Reverend Blackwood's church records contained no entries for Thornfield weddings, nor did those of any other ministers serving the region. The absence of legal documentation, combined with the complete lack of physical evidence for the husband's existence, transformed what had been community acceptance into mounting suspicion. Milliken's investigation notes, preserved in county archives, detail his systematic approach to unraveling Ezekiel's deception. He interviewed every neighbor within 10 miles of the Thornfield property, documenting their testimonies about the timeline of events and their observations of the family's behavior throughout the winter months. Without exception, witnesses confirmed they had never encountered any evidence of the daughters' supposed marriages beyond Ezekiel's own assertions. The identical silver wedding rings, when examined closely, bore no jeweler's marks or personalization that would indicate legitimate purchase. For specific brides. Most damning was Clara Honeysuckle's reluctant testimony about her private conversations with both girls during prenatal visits. The midwife revealed that neither Mercy nor Charity had ever discussed their husbands in the intimate, personal way that new wives typically shared with trusted female advisors. Instead, both girls had repeatedly asked questions about whether childbirth would end their suffering, a phrase that struck Clara as profoundly disturbing, but which she had hesitated to explore while Ezekiel remained alive and vigilant. The systematic nature of Ezekiel's deception became clear as Sheriff Milliken assembled witness testimonies and official records. The Patriarch had constructed an elaborate fiction about his daughter's marriages, complete with detailed backstories about distant relatives and economic justifications for the husband's absence. Yet no physical evidence supported any aspect of his narrative, from marriage certificates to personal belongings to correspondence. The complete fabrication suggested premeditation and careful planning rather than desperate improvisation by a dying man seeking to protect his daughter's reputations. As spring progressed and both pregnancies neared term, the horrible truth about Ezekiel Thornfield's final wish would soon emerge from the shadows of Blackwater Hollow, bringing with it evidence so disturbing that it would challenge everything the mountain community thought they knew about the man they had trusted above all others. Sheriff Milliken's methodical search of the Thornfield cabin on April 3, 1899, uncovered the first concrete evidence that Ezekiel's deception ran far deeper than fabricated marriages. Hidden beneath loose floorboards in the Patriarch's bedroom lay a locked cedar chest, its brass fittings tarnished with age, but its contents preserved in meticulous order. The sheriff's crowbar splintered the lock easily, revealing a collection of documents that would transform suspicion into horror and speculation into undeniable proof of systematic evil. The chest's most damning contents filled a leather-bound journal written in Ezekiel's distinctive hand throughout 1897 and 1898. The entries, preserved today in Newton County Court archives as Evidence Item 7, detailed his growing obsession with what he termed his divine calling, to preserve the Thornfield bloodline through any means necessary. Early passages revealed his belief that God had chosen his daughters as vessels for continuing pure mountain stock, after other family lines had been corrupted by outsiders and weakened by modern influences. Sheriff Milliken's investigation notes recorded his immediate recognition that these writings documented premeditated crimes rather than the desperate improvisation of a dying man. The journal's February 18, 1898 entry contained Ezekiel's explicit plan to ensure both daughters would bear children. Before his death, regardless of conventional morality or legal constraints, he wrote extensively about biblical precedents for unusual family arrangements, citing Old Testament passages he claimed justified his actions as divinely ordained rather than criminal. Most disturbing to investigators was his clinical detachment in describing his daughters not as beloved children, but as breeding stock, whose highest purpose was ensuring Thornfield genetic material survived his passing. Dr. Whitmore's later analysis of these writings identified clear evidence of systematic psychological manipulation designed to overcome natural resistance through religious coercion. Concurrent with discovering the journal, Sheriff Milliken arranged for Dr. Whitmore to conduct thorough medical examinations of both daughters, now that Ezekiel's death had removed the barrier to private medical assessment. The physician's detailed examination reports, filed with the court on April 7th, documented extensive evidence of prolonged physical trauma consistent with systematic sexual abuse over multiple years. Both young women bore scarring and physical damage that corroborated their father's journal entries about when his religious preparation had begun with each daughter upon reaching her 16th birthday. Dr. Whitmore's medical documentation proved particularly crucial because it provided objective, scientific evidence that could not be disputed or dismissed as emotional testimony. His examination of Mercy revealed injuries consistent with forced sexual contact beginning approximately 3 years earlier, precisely matching the timeline suggested in Ezekiel's journal entries from 1896. The physician's clinical notes described physical evidence so extensive and systematic that it left no doubt about the nature and duration of the abuse both daughters had endured, while their community remained willfully blind to their suffering. The breakthrough in witness testimony came when Sheriff Milliken interviewed Mercy privately on April 9th, ensuring her father's intimidating presence could no longer silence her voice. Court stenographer records preserve her detailed account of years of abuse disguised as religious preparation for motherhood, beginning shortly after her 16th birthday, when Ezekiel claimed God had revealed her special destiny to him in prayer. She described how her father had isolated her from potential suitors through elaborate theological explanations about preserving her purity for divine purposes, while simultaneously grooming her to accept increasingly inappropriate physical contact as sacred ritual. Mercy's testimony revealed the sophisticated psychological manipulation Ezekiel had employed to ensure compliance and silence from his victims. He had convinced her that resistance would condemn her soul to eternal damnation, while submission represented obedience to God's will, as interpreted through his spiritual authority. The court records document her description of elaborate blessing ceremonies that were actually systematic sexual abuse, conducted in the cabin's root cellar where her screams would not carry to neighboring properties. Most chilling was her account of Ezekiel's explicit statements that she and her sister were chosen by God to continue the Thornfield bloodline through him, their father and patriarch. Charity's separate testimony on April 10th corroborated every aspect of her sister's account, while adding horrifying details about the escalation of abuse following her own 16th birthday in February 1898. The younger daughter's statement, preserved in court records, described how Ezekiel had used Mercy's compliance as proof that divine will demanded similar submission from Charity. She testified that her father had explicitly threatened to harm Mercy if Charity resisted, creating a system of mutual coercion that ensured both daughters' silence and cooperation through fear for each other's safety. The sisters' testimonies revealed that Ezekiel had spent months preparing them psychologically for their pregnancies, describing the coming children as sacred offerings to preserve the family's pure mountain bloodline. Both daughters testified that their father had conducted mock marriage ceremonies in the cabin's main room, complete with the identical silver rings that had puzzled Dr. Whitmore during his earlier observations. These fake ceremonies served to legitimize the abuse in the girls' minds, while providing Ezekiel with props to support his public fiction about distant husbands when neighbors began noticing the pregnancies. Dr. Whitmore's examination of both pregnancies yielded the investigation's most disturbing medical evidence. His obstetric assessment, documented in detailed medical records filed with the court, revealed that both developing infants showed preliminary signs of genetic abnormalities consistent with inbreeding. The physician's clinical expertise allowed him to identify physical indicators that the children would likely suffer from the genetic complications that result when closely related individuals produce offspring. This medical evidence provided irrefutable proof of the infant's true parentage while forecasting the tragic consequences of Ezekiel's crimes. The accumulating evidence painted a picture of systematic abuse that had been carefully planned and executed over multiple years. Sheriff Milliken's investigation files documented how Ezekiel had isolated his daughters from normal social development, prevented them from forming relationships with appropriate young men, and gradually normalized increasingly inappropriate behavior through religious manipulation. The journal entries showed his progression from initial divine inspiration to detailed planning of how to implement his twisted vision while maintaining his community reputation and avoiding legal consequences. Physical evidence from the cabin supported every aspect of the testimonies and journal revelations. Sheriff Milliken's search uncovered the root cellar where much of the abuse had occurred, complete with makeshift altar and religious iconography that Ezekiel had used to frame his crimes as sacred acts. The basement area contained physical evidence of prolonged use for disturbing purposes, including restraints disguised as prayer aids and religious texts, marked with passages that Ezekiel had twisted to justify his actions. Court records preserved detailed descriptions of these materials as evidence of premeditation and systematic psychological manipulation. The investigation also revealed Ezekiel's manipulation of community trust to enable his crimes without detection. His journal contained detailed observations about which neighbors were most likely to accept his explanations without question, and how to manage community perceptions of his daughter's isolation. He had carefully cultivated his reputation as a protective father concerned with his daughter's spiritual purity, using this facade to explain away their fearful behavior and social withdrawal. The depth of his deception demonstrated sophisticated understanding of how to exploit community religious beliefs and social structures to shield criminal activity. Most significantly, the medical evidence confirmed that both infants would bear the physical consequences of their father's crimes. Dr. Whitmore's prenatal assessment indicated serious genetic complications that would likely result in severe physical and mental disabilities if the children survived birth at all. This medical reality transformed the case from historical crime to ongoing tragedy, as the innocent victims of Ezekiel's obsession would suffer throughout their brief lives. The physician's documentation of these genetic consequences provided undeniable proof of the ultimate cost of the Patriarch's twisted vision of bloodline preservation. Sheriff Milliken's systematic collection of evidence by mid-April 1899 had assembled an unassailable case against Ezekiel Thornfield's memory and reputation. The combination of his own written confessions, medical evidence, physical artifacts, and victim testimony created a comprehensive record that exposed the full scope of his crimes while honoring the courage of his daughters in finally breaking their silence. The stage was now set for revealing the complete horror of how a trusted community leader had transformed religious authority into a tool for systematic family destruction. Clara Honeysuckle's detailed birth ledger, maintained with Cherokee precision for over 30 years, would provide the investigation's most devastating evidence when Mercy went into labor on January 15, 1899. The experienced midwife arrived at the Thornfield cabin expecting a routine mountain birth, but her clinical observations immediately revealed abnormalities that confirmed the horrible truth about the infant's parentage. Her meticulous documentation, preserved in Newton County medical records, described a male child born with severe cleft palate, heart irregularities, and limb deformities consistent with genetic complications from inbreeding. The midwife's professional experience had exposed her to every type of birth complication common in isolated mountain communities. But the systematic nature of this infant's abnormalities struck her as fundamentally different from random genetic misfortune. Clara's birth record noted the child's distinctive facial deformities, including eyes set too close together and ear malformations that medical literature of the period associated specifically with children born to closely related parents. Most disturbing to her experienced eye was the infant's obvious struggle to breathe and feed, indicating internal organ complications that would likely prove fatal within months. Ezekiel's behavior during Mercy's labor provided Clara with additional evidence that something deeply wrong had occurred in the Thornfield household. The dying patriarch insisted on remaining present throughout the delivery, claiming religious authority over the sacred process of birth, but his obvious anxiety and repeated questions about whether the child appeared normal suggested guilty knowledge rather than grandfatherly concern. Sheriff Milliken's later interview with Clara revealed her growing certainty during this delivery that Ezekiel was the infant's father, not some mysterious absent husband, based on his intimate familiarity with details about Mercy's pregnancy that no grandfather should possess. When Charity delivered her infant on March 22nd, just days before Ezekiel's death, Clara's worst suspicions received horrifying confirmation. The second male child exhibited identical deformities to his cousin brother, including the same distinctive facial abnormalities, heart defects, and breathing difficulties that Clara had documented in Mercy's child 10 weeks earlier. Her detailed birth records, submitted to Sheriff Milliken as crucial evidence, noted that both infants shared physical characteristics that indicated not just common parentage, but specifically the genetic consequences of father-daughter incest. Clara's documentation proved particularly valuable because her Cherokee grandmother had taught her to recognize the signs of inbreeding that occasionally appeared in isolated tribal communities. Her cultural knowledge, combined with 3 decades of midwifery experience, enabled her to identify genetic patterns that might have escaped less experienced medical observers. The midwife's testimony described both infants as bearing what Cherokee tradition called the mark of broken blood, physical signs that warned of serious genetic consequences when family lines crossed inappropriately. Sheriff Milliken's discovery of Ezekiel's correspondence with distant relatives revealed the true scope of his planning and the narcissistic pride he took in his crimes. Hidden within the cedar chest alongside his journal were 7 letters written to Thornfield cousins scattered across Arkansas, Tennessee, and Missouri throughout 1897 and 1898. These letters, preserved as evidence items, 15 through 21, documented Ezekiel's boastful announcements about ensuring the family name would continue in absolute purity through his daughter's careful breeding. The correspondence revealed Ezekiel's twisted interpretation of animal husbandry principles applied to human reproduction. His letter to cousin Jeremiah Thornfield in Tennessee, dated October 18, 97, described his plan to maintain the strongest possible Thornfield blood by avoiding contamination from inferior mountain stock. The Patriarch wrote extensively about his research into biblical precedents and his consultation with traveling preachers about theological justification for unusual family arrangements, demonstrating that his crimes were not impulsive actions but carefully planned atrocities executed over multiple years. Most chilling was Ezekiel's letter to his late brother's widow in Missouri, written in December 1897, in which he described his daughters as perfectly suited breeding stock who would produce pure Thornfield heirs under his guidance. The clinical language he used to describe Mercy and Charity revealed his complete dehumanization of his own children, viewing them as livestock rather than human beings deserving protection and love. Sheriff Milliken's investigation notes recorded his disgust at discovering how Ezekiel had reduced his paternal role to that of a breeding manager focused solely on genetic outcomes. The letters also documented Ezekiel's consultation with at least 3 traveling preachers about biblical precedents for unconventional family arrangements. His correspondence with Reverend Elias Crow, an itinerant minister who worked mining camps in western Arkansas, included detailed theological discussions about Old Testament examples of fathers ensuring bloodline continuation through their daughters. These exchanges, preserved in court records, showed how Ezekiel had deliberately sought religious justification for his planned crimes, manipulating Scripture to overcome any remaining moral constraints. Sheriff Milliken's systematic interviews with community members throughout April and May 1899 finally broke the wall of silence that had protected Ezekiel's reputation during his lifetime. Martha Crane, the Thornfields' nearest neighbor, became the first to admit publicly that she had harbored serious suspicions about the family's situation, but had been too intimidated by Ezekiel's authority to voice her concerns. Her testimony, recorded in official court transcripts, revealed that multiple neighbors had privately discussed troubling observations about the daughter's fearful behavior and obvious isolation from normal social interactions. The community's complicit silence emerged as a systematic pattern rather than innocent ignorance. Reverend Blackwood's confession to Sheriff Milliken revealed that he had received anonymous warnings from congregation members about unnatural goings-on at the Thornfield homestead, but had dismissed these concerns as idle gossip rather than investigating legitimate accusations against a respected Confederate veteran. His failure to act on these warnings represented a profound dereliction of pastoral duty that enabled Ezekiel's crimes to continue without interference from religious authority. Multiple neighbors testified that they had noticed the daughter's identical wedding rings appeared during the same week in November 1898, coinciding with the announcement of their supposed marriages. Several witnesses admitted they had found it suspicious that both girls would marry during the same brief period to men whom none of them had ever encountered. But Ezekiel's intimidating presence and community authority prevented anyone from challenging his explanations directly. The testimony revealed how fear of confronting powerful men enabled systematic abuse within seemingly respectable families. Dr. Whitmore's examination of the fabricated marriage certificates discovered in Ezekiel's chest provided definitive proof of premeditated fraud designed to legitimize the pregnancies legally. The documents, written entirely in Ezekiel's distinctive handwriting, purported to record ceremonies performed by Reverend Moses Thornfield of Distant Creek Baptist Church in November 1898. Handwriting analysis confirmed that Ezekiel had forged not only the marriage certificates, but also the minister's signatures and the witness attestations, creating elaborate fictional documentation to support his public lies. The fake certificates contained subtle errors that revealed their fraudulent nature to careful examination. Ezekiel had misspelled several legal terms and used Arkansas marriage law provisions that had been changed in 1896, indicating he had relied on outdated legal documents as templates for his forgeries. Most significantly, the supposed minister Moses Thornfield had never existed, and no Baptist church by that name operated anywhere in Arkansas or surrounding states. Sheriff Milliken's investigation confirmed that every detail on the certificates was fabricated, representing sophisticated document fraud designed to provide legal cover for incestuous pregnancies. The accumulating evidence painted a portrait of crimes so systematic and premeditated that they shocked even experienced lawmen familiar with mountain violence and family dysfunction. Ezekiel had spent at least 2 years planning every aspect of his crimes, from theological justification to legal documentation to community management, demonstrating calculating intelligence directed toward unspeakably evil purposes. His careful preparation revealed not momentary weakness or desperate improvisation, but deliberate criminal enterprise targeting his own daughters for systematic sexual exploitation. The medical evidence provided by both infants' conditions offered irrefutable proof that connected all other elements of the investigation into a coherent picture of systematic incest and abuse. The genetic abnormalities documented by Clara Honeysuckle and Dr. Whitmore could have resulted only from father-daughter incest, eliminating any remaining possibility that Ezekiel's story about distant husbands contained any truth. The children's tragic conditions served as living evidence of their grandfather's crimes, while forecasting the inevitable consequences of his twisted obsession with bloodline purity. Sheriff Milliken's comprehensive evidence collection by late May 1899 had assembled a case that exposed not only individual criminal behavior, but also the community structures that had enabled systematic family abuse to continue undetected for years. The investigation revealed how patriarchal authority, religious manipulation, and social intimidation could combine to shield even the most heinous crimes from detection and intervention. The stage was now set for confronting the full scope of horror that had masqueraded as respectability in the remote mountains of Arkansas. The complete scope of Ezekiel Thornfield's systematic manipulation emerged through Sheriff Milliken's painstaking reconstruction of the daughter's childhood experiences, revealing crimes that began years before any physical abuse occurred. Court stenographer records from June 1899 preserved Mercy's devastating testimony about how her father had isolated her from normal social development starting at age 12, systematically preventing her from forming friendships with other mountain children through elaborate theological explanations about maintaining spiritual purity. Her detailed account described how Ezekiel had convinced her that God required special preparation for her eventual sacred role in preserving the Thornfield bloodline. Mercy's testimony revealed the sophisticated grooming process that had made her vulnerable to later abuse. Sheriff Milliken's investigation notes documented her description of private prayer sessions that began when she turned 13, during which her father taught her that physical contact between them represented divine blessing rather than inappropriate behavior. The court records preserve her account of how these sessions gradually escalated from inappropriate touching to increasingly serious violations, all framed as necessary preparation for her eventual role as vessel for continuing God's chosen bloodline through the Thornfield family. The psychological manipulation techniques Ezekiel employed demonstrated calculating intelligence applied to destroying his daughter's ability to recognize or resist abuse. Mercy testified that her father had taught her to interpret any feelings of discomfort or resistance as evidence of sinful rebellion against God's will, requiring additional spiritual correction through increased physical contact and religious instruction. Sheriff Milliken's notes recorded her description of elaborate punishment rituals disguised as prayer sessions, during which Ezekiel convinced her that her natural revulsion represented evil influences that required purification through submission to his authority. Charity's separate testimony provided even more disturbing evidence of systematic psychological destruction beginning in early childhood. The younger daughter's court statement, preserved in Newton County archives, described how she had witnessed her sister's special religious training for years before her own 16th birthday brought similar treatment. Her testimony revealed that Ezekiel had used Mercy's apparent compliance as proof that God approved of his methods, while simultaneously threatening Charity that resistance would result in eternal damnation for both sisters and their deceased mother's spirit. The investigation uncovered physical evidence of the elaborate religious framework Ezekiel had constructed to justify his crimes to his victims and potentially to himself. Sheriff Milliken's search of the cabin's root cellar revealed a makeshift altar decorated with twisted interpretations of biblical passages about bloodline preservation, family loyalty, and divine obedience. The sheriff's evidence inventory, filed with Newton County Court, documented religious artifacts that Ezekiel had modified or created specifically to support his fictional theology about father-daughter breeding as sacred duty. Most chilling was the discovery of Ezekiel's private theological writings hidden behind loose stones in the cellar wall. These documents, catalogued as evidence items 28 through 34, contained his elaborate justifications for incest based on carefully selected biblical passages and his own twisted interpretations of divine will. The writings revealed how he had spent years developing a complete religious system that framed his criminal desires as sacred obligations, demonstrating premeditation that extended far beyond simple opportunistic abuse. Community members finally began admitting their complicity in enabling the crimes through willful ignorance and deliberate blindness to obvious warning signs. Martha Crane's expanded testimony in June revealed that she and other neighbor women had privately discussed the Thornfield daughters' fearful behavior, obvious isolation, and their father's excessive control over every aspect of their lives. Her confession to Sheriff Milliken, preserved in official records, described multiple conversations among mountain women about troubling observations that should have prompted intervention, but instead remained private gossip. The systematic nature of community enablement became clear as more neighbors admitted to suppressing their suspicions rather than challenging Ezekiel's authority. Reverend Blackwood's detailed confession revealed that he had received at least 4 separate warnings from congregation members about unnatural activities at the Thornfield homestead, but had dismissed these concerns as malicious rumors rather than investigating serious accusations against a respected Confederate veteran. His failure to act represented not innocent oversight, but deliberate negligence that prioritized social harmony over child protection. Sheriff Milliken's interviews with traveling merchants and seasonal workers revealed that Ezekiel's control over his daughters had been visible to outsiders for years before the pregnancies made his crimes undeniable. Multiple witnesses testified that they had noticed the girls' fearful behavior around men, their father's aggressive monitoring of any interactions with potential suitors, and their obvious lack of normal social development compared to other mountain young women. These observations, documented in sworn statements, showed that warning signs had been apparent to anyone willing to look honestly at the Thornfield family dynamics. The investigation revealed how Ezekiel had systematically eliminated potential romantic relationships that might have protected his daughters from his abuse. Court records preserved testimony from 3 young mountain men who had attempted to court mercy during 1896 and 1897, only to be driven away by Ezekiel's increasingly aggressive interference and threats of violence. His success in isolating his daughters from appropriate suitors had been accomplished through intimidation, and his reputation for settling disputes with violence when necessary. Dr. Whitmore's psychological assessment of both daughters revealed the sophisticated mental conditioning that had made them compliant victims for years before their pregnancies exposed the abuse. His professional evaluation, submitted to the court in July 1899, documented symptoms of prolonged psychological manipulation, including learned helplessness, religious delusions imposed through systematic indoctrination, and complete dependence on their abuser's interpretation of reality. The physician's clinical notes described mental damage that would require years of careful treatment to overcome. The scope of Ezekiel's crimes extended beyond direct abuse to include systematic destruction of his daughter's capacity for independent thought and moral judgment. Both young women's testimonies revealed how their father had convinced them that normal family relationships in other households represented spiritual corruption, while their own situation represented divine blessing that required absolute secrecy to protect from worldly interference. Sheriff Milliken's notes documented how thoroughly Ezekiel had inverted moral reality within his household, making his victims believe that resistance would constitute sin while submission represented virtue. Physical evidence from the cabin revealed the elaborate system of control Ezekiel had maintained over every aspect of his daughters' lives. The sheriff's inventory documented locked storage areas containing the girls' personal belongings, reading materials selected specifically to reinforce religious themes about obedience and sacrifice, and correspondence with the outside world that Ezekiel had intercepted and destroyed to maintain their isolation. The systematic nature of this control demonstrated that the abuse represented not impulsive behavior, but calculated long-term exploitation designed to ensure compliance and silence. The investigation also revealed how Ezekiel had manipulated religious authority figures to validate his control over his daughters without exposing his crimes. Court records preserve copies of his correspondence with various traveling preachers, in which he had solicited theological opinions about patriarchal authority and biblical precedents for unusual family arrangements. These letters showed how he had gathered religious justification for his actions while maintaining plausible deniability about his specific intentions, demonstrating sophisticated manipulation of community religious structures. Most disturbing was the discovery that Ezekiel had been planning his crimes for at least 5 years before implementing them. Hidden journal entries dating to 1894 revealed his initial fantasies about ensuring bloodline preservation through his daughters, followed by systematic research into biblical justification and careful observation of his daughters' physical and psychological development. The earliest entries showed him already viewing Mercy as potential breeding stock when she was only 14 years old, revealing the calculating patience with which he had planned their destruction. The complete investigation by summer 1899 had exposed crimes so systematic and comprehensive that they challenged traditional understanding of family abuse and community responsibility. Sheriff Milliken's evidence collection revealed not a moment of weakness or desperate improvisation, but a carefully executed criminal enterprise that had destroyed 2 young lives while operating under the protection of religious authority and patriarchal privilege. The psychological damage documented by Dr. Whitmore showed that Ezekiel's victims would bear the consequences of his crimes for the remainder of their lives, while the community's complicit silence had enabled years of systematic torture disguised as divine calling. The accumulating evidence painted a portrait of evil so methodical and comprehensive that it shocked even experienced investigators familiar with the worst aspects of human nature. Every aspect of the daughters' lives had been manipulated and controlled to serve Ezekiel's twisted vision, from their childhood education to their religious instruction to their complete isolation from normal social development that might have provided protection or escape from their father's systematic abuse. Judge Cornelius Pemberton convened Newton County Court in extraordinary session on August 15, 1899, to address the unprecedented legal questions raised by Sheriff Milliken's comprehensive investigation into Ezekiel Thornfield's crimes. The judge's opening statement, preserved in complete court transcripts, acknowledged that while death had denied earthly justice to the perpetrator, the overwhelming evidence demanded formal legal recognition of his victim's suffering and official condemnation of crimes that had shocked the Arkansas Mountain community. His ruling would establish crucial precedents for prosecuting family abuse cases throughout the state's isolated regions. The court's first decisive action declared all of Ezekiel's fabricated marriage certificates legally void, officially documenting that Mercy and Charity had never been married, and that their children were the products of incestuous abuse rather than legitimate unions. Judge Pemberton's written decision, filed as Newton County Court Record 1899-034, stated that the forged documents represented criminal fraud designed to legitimize systematic sexual abuse of minor children by their father. The ruling provided legal vindication for the sisters while ensuring their children would not bear the legal stigma of illegitimacy despite their tragic circumstances. Most significantly, the court's formal declaration that Ezekiel Thornfield had committed criminal incest, systematic child abuse, and document fraud created the first posthumous criminal conviction in Arkansas legal history. Judge Pemberton's ruling established that death could not shield criminals from legal accountability when sufficient evidence existed to prove their guilt beyond reasonable doubt. The decision, preserved in Arkansas Supreme Court archives, became precedent for future cases involving deceased perpetrators and comprehensive evidence of systematic family abuse. The community's sense of divine justice manifested tragically through the deaths of both infants within 4 months of birth, their genetic complications proving too severe for survival despite Dr. Whitmore's dedicated medical care. Mercy's son died on May 20th from heart failure caused by congenital defects, while Charity's infant followed on July 8th after weeks of struggle with breathing difficulties and feeding problems. Clara Honeysuckle's death certificates, preserved in county records, documented the medical causes while noting that mountain neighbors viewed these deaths as God's retribution against Ezekiel's unnatural crimes. The Arkansas Methodist Church's intervention in relocating both young women represented unprecedented organized response to family abuse cases in rural communities. Reverend Samuel Morrison, District ER's Superintendent for Western Arkansas, personally coordinated the sisters' transfer to Little Rock, where Methodist social services provided new identities, medical care, and educational opportunities to help them rebuild their shattered lives. Church records maintained in Little Rock Methodist archives document the comprehensive support system established to ensure both women could escape their father's legacy and create independent futures. The sale of the Thornfield property in October 1899 provided funds for the sisters' ongoing medical care, while symbolically erasing Ezekiel's physical legacy from Blackwater Hollow. Sheriff Milliken's administration of the estate, documented in probate records, ensured that proceeds from the 400-acre homestead went directly to supporting the victims rather than enriching distant relatives who had ignored warning signs of abuse. The buyer, a timber company from Little Rock, eventually cleared the land completely, removing even the foundations of the cabin where so much suffering had occurred. Dr. Whitmore's comprehensive medical documentation of both daughters' recovery progress provided crucial evidence for developing treatment protocols for similar abuse cases throughout Arkansas. His detailed case notes, submitted to the Arkansas Medical Association in 1900, described the psychological and physical healing processes, while emphasizing the importance of removing victims from abusive environments and providing sustained professional care. The physician's pioneering work in documenting family abuse recovery became foundation for Arkansas's first formal guidelines for treating incest survivors. The legal reforms triggered by the Thornfield case transformed how Arkansas addressed family abuse in isolated communities. The legislature's passage of the Rural Family Protection Act of 1900 established mandatory reporting requirements for suspected child abuse, created legal frameworks for investigating crimes in remote areas, and provided funding for circuit-riding investigators trained specifically in family violence cases. Sheriff Milliken's investigation methods became standard training for lawmen throughout the mountain counties, ensuring future cases would receive proper attention despite geographical challenges. Newton County's establishment of the first formal archive system for criminal case records ensured that evidence from the Thornfield investigation would remain available for future legal precedent and historical documentation. The complete case file, maintained in fireproof storage, includes Sheriff Milliken's investigation notes, all witness testimonies, medical records, physical evidence, and court proceedings. This comprehensive preservation of evidence became the model for criminal record-keeping throughout Arkansas, ensuring that justice could be served even decades after crimes were committed. The Methodist Church's continued monitoring of both sisters through 1920 confirmed the success of their relocation and recovery efforts. Sealed church correspondence, available only to authorized researchers, documents Mercy's work as a seamstress in Little Rock until her death in 1943, while Charity found employment in textile mills before her tragic death during childbirth in 1934. Both women lived quietly but independently, their courage in breaking silence having created lasting protection for future generations of vulnerable children. The abandoned Thornfield property became an unofficial monument to the triumph of truth over institutional silence and the power of systematic investigation to expose even the most carefully hidden crimes. Visitors to Newton County can still locate the clearing where the homestead once stood, now marked only by a few foundation stones that serve as reminder of how evil can flourish in isolation but cannot ultimately escape the persistent pursuit of justice through proper legal channels and community accountability. The case's lasting legacy lies not in the horror of Ezekiel's crimes, but in the systematic exposure of institutional failures that enabled his abuse and the comprehensive reforms that emerged to prevent similar tragedies. Sheriff Milliken's methodical investigation, Dr. Whitmore's medical documentation, and Judge Pemberton's unprecedented legal rulings created a framework for protecting vulnerable individuals that extended far beyond Newton County's mountain hollows. The courage of mercy and charity in finally breaking their silence transformed their personal suffering into lasting protection for countless other children who might otherwise have remained trapped in similar circumstances. The complete preservation of evidence in Newton County archives ensures that the truth about Ezekiel Thornfield's crimes remains available to researchers, legal scholars, and law enforcement officials who continue building on the precedents established in 1899. Justice may have been delayed by the perpetrator's death, but the systematic exposure of his crimes and the comprehensive legal response proved that evil cannot hide forever when determined investigators refuse to accept comfortable lies over uncomfortable truths.